The classroom smelled faintly of dry erase markers and old textbooks, the kind of smell that never quite left no matter how many times the windows were opened. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Jefferson High School in a quiet suburb of Atlanta, landing in uneven rectangles across rows of worn desks. On the walls hung posters about college readiness, leadership, and equal opportunity, their edges curling with age. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Evelyn Carter. She had been teaching history for over 20 years. White, well-dressed, respected by administration, she was known for her sharp tongue and no-nonsense attitude. Students feared her pop quizzes and her sarcasm, but many parents praised her for being old school and tough but fair. At least, that's how she saw herself. In the third row near the window sat Marcus Hill, a black student, 16 years old, tall for his age, shoulders slightly hunched as if he had learned to make himself smaller. His notebook was open, his pen ready, his eyes focused, not wandering, not distracted. Marcus liked school, not because it was easy, but because it was his way out. He lived with his mother and younger sister in a small apartment across town. His mother worked 2 jobs. His father had been gone for years. Marcus had learned early that excuses didn't change reality, and effort was the only thing no one could take from him. But effort, he was learning, didn't always earn respect. "Mr. Hill," Mrs. Carter said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet room. Marcus looked up immediately. "Yes, ma'am." She tapped her marker against the whiteboard. "Since you seem so attentive, perhaps you'd like to answer the question." A few students turned in their seats. Some smirked. They had seen this before. Mrs. Carter gestured to the board. "Explain the economic causes of the Great Depression." Marcus straightened slightly. He had studied this. He took a breath. The main economic causes included the stock market crash of 1929, widespread bank failures, reduced consumer spending, and... Mrs. Carter interrupted with a short laugh. "Let's slow down," she said. "I'm not asking for something you memorized off Wikipedia. I'm asking for understanding." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the class. Marcus felt heat rise to his face, but he continued. Those factors reduced industrial output and led to massive unemployment. Mrs. Carter sighed dramatically. "Marcus," she said, shaking her head, "this is a history class, not a motivational speech. Maybe focus less on sounding impressive and more on the basics." The words landed hard. Marcus stopped speaking. He nodded once and sat back down, eyes fixed on his notebook. Mrs. Carter turned back to the board, satisfied. "Anyone else?" she asked. A white student in the front row raised his hand and repeated almost the same answer Marcus had just given, less detailed, less confident. Mrs. Carter smiled. "Yes, exactly," she said warmly. "Very good." Marcus didn't look up, but he heard it. Every word. This wasn't the first time. When Marcus asked thoughtful questions, Mrs. Carter called them off-topic. When he used advanced vocabulary, she said he was trying too hard. When he scored high on tests, she suggested he had gotten help. And when he stayed quiet, she called him disengaged. By the end of the class, Marcus felt smaller than when he had walked in. As the bell rang, students packed their bags. Marcus stood, slipping his notebook into his backpack. Mrs. Carter stopped him. "Marcus," she said, her tone falsely pleasant. A word. He walked to her desk. "You're clearly capable," she said, lowering her voice. "But you need to be realistic. Not everyone is suited for academic leadership. College is demanding. Administration, law, education. Those paths require a certain... polish." Marcus looked at her, confused. "Yes, ma'am." She gave a thin smile. "Just focus on graduating. Set reasonable goals." Reasonable. Marcus nodded again. "I understand." But as he walked out of the classroom, something settled deep inside him. Not anger, not bitterness, but resolve. Because Marcus didn't want to prove her wrong out of pride, he wanted to prove that students like him didn't need permission to lead. And years later, when Mrs. Evelyn Carter sat in a quiet auditorium listening to a new principal introduce himself, she would finally understand how wrong she had been when Marcus Hill stepped onto the stage and thanked his teachers for teaching him exactly who he never wanted to become. Marcus didn't go straight home after school that day. Instead, he sat on the concrete steps behind the gym, his backpack at his feet, the sounds of practice echoing faintly through the brick walls. The afternoon sun was warm, but he barely felt it. His notebook lay open on his lap, the same page Mrs. Carter had dismissed, still filled with careful handwriting. He reread it slowly. Nothing was wrong with his answer. He knew that. Yet her voice replayed in his head, calm and dismissive, wrapped in politeness sharp enough to cut. Trying too hard. Be realistic. Reasonable goals. Marcus closed the notebook and leaned back, staring at the sky. He had learned early that some people didn't see him as a student first. They saw a stereotype and worked backward from there. When he finally got home, the apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. His mother wouldn't be back for hours. His little sister was still at after-school care. Marcus made himself a sandwich and sat at the small kitchen table, textbooks spread out like a shield. He studied harder than usual that night, not because of fear, but because studying gave him control. In books, facts didn't change depending on who was speaking. Weeks passed. Mrs. Carter's behavior didn't improve. If anything, it became subtler, which made it worse. Sarcasm replaced direct criticism. Raised eyebrows replaced outright comments. When Marcus volunteered answers, she rarely called on him. When she did, it felt like a test he was expected to fail. Other students noticed. Some avoided sitting near him, afraid of becoming targets themselves. Others whispered that Marcus was teacher's problem, as if curiosity itself were a crime. A few admired his persistence, but admiration didn't protect him. One afternoon, the class was assigned a group project, a presentation on civil rights movements. The irony didn't escape Marcus. Groups formed quickly. No one invited him. Mrs. Carter noticed and smiled thinly. "Marcus, you can work alone," she said. "You seem independent." He nodded. "That's fine." And it was. Marcus spent hours in the public library, reading primary sources, watching old interviews, studying speeches. He didn't just want to present facts, he wanted to understand systems, patterns, leadership. He wanted to know how change actually happened. Presentation day arrived. Groups went first, slides full of bullet points, surface-level summaries, polite applause. Then it was Marcus's turn. He stood at the front of the class, heart steady, voice clear. He spoke about strategy, education, and institutions, about how real progress required people inside the system who understood both injustice and structure. He quoted historians, he referenced court cases, he connected the past to the present. The room was quiet. Even Mrs. Carter stopped grading papers. When he finished, there was a brief pause, then scattered claps. Not loud, but sincere. Mrs. Carter cleared her throat. "Well," she said, choosing her words carefully, "that was ambitious." Ambitious. She gave him a B+. Marcus stared at the grade later, disbelief tightening his chest. It was the lowest score given that day. That night, he showed the project to his mother. She read it slowly, carefully, the way she did everything after long shifts. "This is excellent," she said firmly. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Marcus nodded. "I won't." From that moment on, something changed in him. He stopped seeking approval. He stopped raising his hand in Mrs. Carter's class. He listened, observed, took notes, not just on history, but on people. He paid attention to who was encouraged and who was tolerated, who was assumed capable and who had to prove it every single day, and he made a quiet promise to himself. If he ever stood at the front of a classroom or behind a principal's desk, no student would ever feel invisible or small for daring to think beyond what others expected of them. Mrs. Carter never noticed the shift. She mistook his silence for acceptance. She had no idea it was preparation. Marcus's junior year passed, then senior year began, and, by then, he had learned how to survive Mrs. Carter's classroom without letting it define him. He sat in the same seat near the window, but something about him was different. He no longer hunched his shoulders. He no longer rushed his answers or tried to soften his intelligence to make others comfortable. He did his work, turned it in on time, and kept his thoughts mostly to himself. And Mrs. Carter noticed. She noticed the quiet confidence. She noticed that Marcus's essays were still among the strongest in the class. She noticed that other teachers spoke highly of him in meetings. What she didn't notice, or didn't want to, was why she suddenly felt uneasy around him. One afternoon, Marcus was called to the guidance office. The counselor, a kind black woman named Ms. Reynolds, smiled when she saw him. "Marcus," she said, "have you thought about where you want to apply for college?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "Education policy, maybe school leadership one day." Ms. Reynolds nodded, impressed. "That's ambitious." Marcus smiled faintly. He had learned the difference between ambition as encouragement and ambition as criticism. "I think you should apply to some very competitive schools," she continued. "Your grades, your recommendations, they're strong." When Marcus returned to class, Mrs. Carter was lecturing about post-war America. She paused when she saw him re-enter. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said. "College counseling." Her lips pressed together for just a second too long. Later that week, students were asked to submit a personal statement draft for feedback. Marcus hesitated before turning his in. It wasn't about hardship for sympathy, it was about responsibility, systems, and the power of education to change trajectories. Mrs. Carter returned the papers 2 days later. When she reached Marcus's desk, she placed his essay down without comment. After class, he checked the margins. Red ink. Well written, but perhaps unrealistic. Leadership roles require more than idealism. Consider narrowing your aspirations. Marcus stared at the page for a long time. Then he folded it neatly and put it away. He didn't argue, he didn't complain. Instead, he applied anyway. Months later, the acceptance letter arrived. A full scholarship. When Marcus told Ms. Reynolds, she hugged him. When he told his mother, she cried. When the announcement was made at the senior awards assembly, the auditorium erupted in applause. Mrs. Carter clapped too, but her smile was stiff. After graduation, Marcus walked across the stage with his head high. Mrs. Carter shook his hand like she did for every student. "Good luck," she said. "College will be challenging." Marcus met her eyes. "I'm ready." Years passed. College was hard, harder than anything Marcus had known, but it was fair. Professors argued with him, challenged him, pushed him, but they never questioned whether he belonged. He thrived, he studied education systems, earned advanced degrees, and returned to public schools. Not as a student, but as a teacher, then an administrator, then an assistant principal. Marcus never forgot the students who sat quietly near windows. He called on them, he encouraged them, he defended them. And one spring morning, years later, he received a phone call. "Marcus Hill," the voice said, "the board has approved your appointment as principal of Jefferson High School." The same school, the same halls, the same classroom where a teacher once told him to be realistic. Marcus closed his eyes and breathed. He wasn't coming back for revenge. He was coming back to change what realism meant. The first day Marcus walked back into Jefferson High School as principal, the building felt smaller than it had in his memory. The lockers were the same dull blue. The floors still carried the faint smell of cleaning solution and old paper. The banners on the walls had been updated, but the energy, the unspoken hierarchy of who mattered and who didn't, lingered in ways that were harder to name. Teachers gathered in the auditorium for the staff meeting. Conversations hummed with curiosity and skepticism. A new principal was always an event, especially one as young as Marcus appeared to be. Mrs. Evelyn Carter sat in the third row, her posture straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. She had been teaching even longer now, her hair threaded with grey, her reputation intact. When she heard the name Marcus Hill announced as the new principal weeks earlier, it hadn't registered. Names came and went. Students came and went. People like her stayed. The superintendent stepped to the microphone and spoke about leadership, community, and progress. Then he invited the new principal to the stage. Marcus walked out calmly, dressed in a simple suit, shoulders relaxed, eyes scanning the room, not for approval, but for understanding. Applause filled the auditorium, polite at first, then warmer as he reached the podium. Mrs. Carter clapped too, and then Marcus spoke. He thanked the district. He thanked the teachers. He spoke about equity, expectations, and responsibility, not as buzzwords, but as daily practices. His voice was steady, practiced, thoughtful. Then his eyes moved through the crowd, and they stopped. Mrs. Carter felt it before she understood it. A tightening in her chest. A flicker of recognition that made no sense at first. The voice, the cadence, the calm confidence that felt familiar. Marcus paused for a fraction of a second, then continued. "I'm proud to return to Jefferson High," he said. "This school shaped me. It taught me lessons I still carry, about history, about leadership, and about how power can be used to open doors or quietly close them." Mrs. Carter's hands went still. Memories surfaced uninvited. A tall black student by the window, a notebook full of careful writing, a voice she had interrupted. Her breath caught. Marcus didn't look at her directly, but somehow she knew. He remembered. After the meeting, teachers lined up to introduce themselves. Marcus shook hands, smiled, asked questions. When Mrs. Carter reached him, she stopped. For a long moment, neither spoke. "Mr. Hill," she said finally, her voice measured. "Congratulations." "Thank you, Mrs. Carter," Marcus replied. He said her name easily. She searched his face, hoping for resentment, for accusation, for something she could defend herself against. There was none. "I taught here a long time," she said, uncertain why she felt the need to explain herself. "I've seen many students succeed." "I know," Marcus said. There was no accusation in his tone, and somehow that made it worse. As she walked away, Mrs. Carter felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not fear, but the quiet weight of realization that the student she once told to be realistic had returned, not to confront her, but to lead her, and that the lesson she had dismissed had outgrown her classroom. The weeks that followed Marcus Hill's return to Jefferson High School were unlike anything the school had experienced in years. Change didn't come loudly. There were no dramatic announcements, no public call-outs, no symbolic gestures meant to shame anyone. Instead, Marcus walked the halls. He sat in classrooms, he listened, he watched how students were spoken to, who was encouraged to speak, and who learned quickly that silence was safer. Mrs. Carter noticed him everywhere. Sometimes he stood quietly in the back of her classroom during lessons. He never interrupted, never corrected. He took notes, not on content, but on tone, on which students were praised and which were managed, on how often Marcus's old seat near the window was still occupied by students who looked like they were trying to disappear. At first, Mrs. Carter told herself she was imagining things, but the unease stayed. One afternoon, Marcus asked her to meet him in his office. It was a simple room. No grand desk, no framed awards. Just books, student artwork on the walls, and a wide window overlooking the school courtyard. "Please sit," Marcus said. She did. "I want to talk about expectations," he began. "Not policy, practice." Mrs. Carter nodded cautiously. "Of course." Marcus folded his hands. "Do you believe all students are capable of leadership?" She hesitated. "I believe capability looks different in different students." Marcus nodded. "It does, but belief shows up in small moments. Who we interrupt, who we doubt, who we tell to be realistic, the word landed gently. But it landed. Mrs. Carter inhaled sharply. If this is about the past, it's about the present, Marcus said calmly, and the future. He didn't accuse her. He didn't raise his voice. He simply told her what he expected from every educator in the building. Curiosity before judgment, challenge without humiliation, and the understanding that intelligence does not need to perform to be valid. When she left his office, Mrs. Carter felt exposed in a way she never had before. That night, she reread old lesson plans, old feedback, old comments written in red ink, and for the first time she saw a pattern she had always denied. Months passed. Mrs. Carter changed, slowly, awkwardly at first. She listened more, she interrupted less. She began calling on students she once overlooked, and when they spoke, she waited. Students noticed. So did Marcus. At the end of the school year, Jefferson High posted its highest college acceptance rates in over a decade. Disciplinary referrals dropped. Student councils became more diverse. Classrooms grew louder, not with chaos, but with voices that had learned they were allowed to exist. On the final day of school, the auditorium filled once more. Marcus stood at the podium, looking out at the teachers who shaped the building every day. Education isn't about power, he said. It's about permission. Permission to think, to lead, to imagine more than what's expected. His eyes moved briefly to Mrs. Carter. She met his gaze. This time, she didn't look away. After the applause faded, she approached him. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "Not just for you, for the students I never really saw." Marcus nodded. "What matters is that you see them now." As the school emptied for summer, Marcus stood alone in the hallway near the window, the same one where he had once sat, shrinking himself to fit expectations. Sunlight poured in, unchanged. But everything else had, because the student who was once mocked hadn't come back to prove anyone wrong. He had come back to make sure no one else ever learned to doubt themselves in the same way again.